The Joseon Dynasty had a chilling menu of punishments for its enemies. Banishment to a desolate, wine-swept island. A silken cord delivered to your door. A quiet and dignified command to end your own life. A bowl of poison, courteously offered and impossible to refuse. But for one young prince, a legend tells of a punishment far crueler than any blade, more horrifying than any poison. He wasn't just executed by his family. He was sealed inside a tomb and left to suffocate in the dark. This is the story of a royal who was supposedly buried alive by his own blood. It's a tale of ultimate betrayal, of an unspeakable cruelty whispered in the shadowy corridors of the royal palace. A story so vile, it has haunted the dynasty's memory for centuries. But did it actually happen? The truth, as we are about to discover, is buried deeper and is far more disturbing than any single legend. The horrifying myth of a prince entombed alive is a gateway, a dark portal into the very real, and arguably more terrifying, stories of princes who were indeed destroyed by their own families. Welcome to Chronicles of Old Tales. Today, we investigate a royal tragedy, a story of palace intrigue so dark it blurs the line between fact and fiction, and uncover the very real horrors that inspired the legend. The legend, as it's often told, speaks of a young prince, sometimes given the name Jeonchang, caught in the suffocating web of palace politics. He was a pawn in a deadly game played by his more powerful relatives, uncles, brothers, even his own father. The details are hazy, as they so often are in tales passed down through whispers. His crime could have been anything: a flicker of ambition in his eyes, a careless word spoken in the wrong company, or simply the bad luck of being born to the wrong mother at the wrong time. The punishment, however, was brutally specific. He was to be entombed, sealed within stone walls, while still breathing, a living ghost in a dynasty that demanded absolute, terrifying obedience. It's a powerful, visceral image, one that sinks its claws into your imagination. But when we turn to the official, meticulous records of the era, the annals of the Joseon Dynasty, a document so detailed it's now a UNESCO memory of the world treasure, problem arises. There is no record of a Prince Jeonchang meeting this specific fate. The name itself feels like a ghost, a placeholder in a narrative of absolute horror. The story appears to be a conflation, a historical fiction born from the very real anxieties of a very dangerous time. So, if this specific story isn't true, why does it feel so real? Why does it persist? Because the world it describes, the Joseon royal court, was a place where something so monstrous could have happened. It was a gilded cage, yes, but its bars were forged from paranoia, seething jealousy, and a relentless, bloody pursuit of power. The Joseon Dynasty, which ruled Korea for over 500 years, was founded on the bedrock of Neo-Confucianism. On paper, this promised a society built on order, filial piety, and unwavering moral obligation. The king was the son of heaven, a benevolent father to his people. His family was meant to be a perfect model of harmony. But in reality, the court was a viper's nest. Powerful aristocratic clans, the Yangban were locked in a constant battle for influence, forming factions that would stop at nothing to place their allies in positions of power and, more importantly, to eliminate their rivals. These weren't polite political debates, they were life-or-death contests that frequently ended in purges, exiles, and executions. For the royal family, this system was uniquely poisonous. A prince was never just a son or a brother, he was a potential king. Every male born into the royal line, by his very existence, represented a potential shift in power, a living banner for a disgruntled faction to rally around. This made every prince, from the moment of his birth, both a treasure and a target. The dynasty's very beginning was soaked in the blood of brothers. Its founder, King Taejo, was a formidable general, but his succession plans were a catastrophe. When he broke with tradition and named his youngest son from his second wife as crown prince, his fifth son from his first wife, the brilliant, ambitious, and utterly ruthless Yi Bangwon felt a betrayal that would curdle into violence. In 1398, Yi Bangwon launched a coup. In a shocking act of brutality that would set a terrifying precedent for centuries to come, he and his followers stormed the palace. They murdered not only the chief minister who supported his young half-brother but also two of his own half-brothers, including the crown prince. This became known as the First Strife of Princes. Their father, King Taejo, was so horrified that his sons were slaughtering one another for the throne he had built that he abdicated in disgust. But the bloodshed wasn't over. Just 2 years later, a second strife of princes erupted, pitting Yi Bangwon against another one of his older brothers. Was victorious once again, and finally took the throne as king. This was the terrifying foundation of the Joseon Dynasty. Family ties were a distant second to the acquisition and stability of the throne. An uncle, a brother, a nephew, these were just titles. In the cold, hard calculus of power, they were obstacles. And it is in this brutal context that the legend of a prince buried alive feels not just plausible, but almost inevitable. While the story of Prince Jeongchang may be a phantom, the palace halls echoed with the real screams of princes whose fates were just as tragic, and in some cases, even more bizarre and cruel. To find the truth behind the legend, we must look at the real victims, the boys and young men who were sacrificed on the altar of ambition. Our first case is that of a boy who was crowned king only to be cast down and destroyed by the man who should have protected him most, his uncle. The story of King Danjong is perhaps Joseon's most poignant tragedy, a tale so archetypal it feels like a dark fairy tale. It has all the elements: a young orphaned king, a council of loyal but doomed advisors, and a ruthless, power-hungry uncle. Born in 1441, Danjong was the grandson of the legendary King Sejong the Great. His path to the throne was paved with sorrow from the very beginning. His mother died just a day after giving birth to him, and his father, King Munjong, was a sickly ruler who passed away when Danjong was only 12 years old. At just 12 years of age, Danjong was now the king of a powerful nation, but he was utterly alone and catastrophically vulnerable. His father, knowing his own health was failing, had desperately tried to protect his young son from the dangers he knew were coming. On his deathbed, he entrusted Danjong to a council of high officials, men like the esteemed scholar Wang Bo-in and the formidable general Kim Jong-seo. Their sole mission, to guide the young king and protect his throne from the wolves circling within the palace. The largest and most dangerous of those wolves came from inside the family itself, in the form of Danjong's own uncle, Grand Prince Suyang. Suyang was the second son of King Sejong, a man of immense ambition, razor-sharp intelligence, and magnetic charisma. He was a skilled warrior, a patron of the arts, and had been deeply involved in running the country during his father's reign. He saw himself as the true and capable heir, far more suited to rule than his young, inexperienced nephew. In his eyes, the council of officials wasn't protecting the throne, they were stealing royal authority for themselves. He would later claim he was acting to save the dynasty from corrupt ministers, but his actions reveal a man driven by an insatiable hunger for the crown. For a year, an uneasy, suffocating tension gripped the court. The council governed in Danjong's name, while Suyang quietly gathered his allies, a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came in 1453. In a meticulously planned and brutally executed coup, Suyang made his move. He first invited his primary rival, General Kim Jong-seo, to his home and had him assassinated. Then, using a forged royal order, he summoned the remaining council members to the palace. As they arrived, They were ambushed and cut down. In a single bloody night, the entire leadership loyal to the late king was annihilated. Suyang was now in complete control. He didn't seize the throne immediately. The appearance of legitimacy was everything. He forced the terrified 12-year-old Danjong to promote him and his allies to the highest positions in government. Then he began a systematic purge of anyone he even suspected might be a threat. To consolidate his power, he even turned on his own brothers, forcing his younger brother, Prince Anpyeong, who had sided with the council, to commit suicide by poison. Suyang was methodically, cruelly, removing every pillar of support Danjong had, isolating the boy king until he had no one left. For 2 years, Danjong remained a king in name only, a prisoner in his own palace, forced to watch as his uncle dismantled his father's legacy and ruled in his stead. The pressure was immense. Finally, in 1455, Suyang's allies formally advised the boy king that he was too young and weak to rule, and that he should abdicate in favor of his strong and wise uncle. Danjong, powerless and facing certain death if he refused, had no choice. He surrendered the throne to the man who had murdered his protectors and his kin. Grand Prince Suyang was now King Seo. But even with the crown on his head, Seo was not secure. The ghost of the legitimate king still haunted him. Many scholars and officials saw Seo as a bloody usurper, their loyalty remaining with the deposed boy king. In 1456, a group of 6 officials, who would later be immortalized as the 6 martyred ministers, hatched a secret plot to assassinate Seo and restore Danjong to the throne. The plot was discovered when one of the conspirators lost his nerve and confessed. The king's vengeance was swift and horrific. The 6 ministers were arrested and brutally tortured to reveal the names of their co-conspirators. Despite the agony, they refused to repent, proclaiming their loyalty to Danjong with their last breaths. They were all executed in the most gruesome ways imaginable, their families punished for generations, and their names erased from official records. This failed plot sealed Danjong's fate. He was no longer just a retired king, he was a living symbol of rebellion, a threat Seo could no longer tolerate. Danjong was stripped of his titles and banished to the remote and rugged region of Yongwo. His place of exile, Cheonggyeongpo, was a natural prison, a piece of land surrounded on 3 sides by a deep river and backed by a sheer cliff. Here, the 16-year-old former king lived in lonely isolation, his every move watched. But even in exile, his memory was too dangerous. In late 1457, after another alleged plot was uncovered, Seo's court concluded that their former king had to be permanently erased. Seo sent royal emissaries to Yongwo with a death sentence. How exactly Danjong died is a matter of historical debate. Some accounts say he accepted his fate and drank a bowl of poison delivered on the king's order. Another, more gruesome version claims he was locked in his room while the traditional underfloor heating system, the **, was stoked to a furious temperature, suffocating him to death in an unbearably hot chamber. At just 17 years old, King Danjong was dead. Traditional accounts say his body was unceremoniously thrown into the river. King Seo forbade anyone from retrieving it or giving it a proper burial, on pain of death for 3 generations of their family. But a local official named Yam Hyung-do defied the tyrant king's decree, secretly recovering the boy's body and burying him on a nearby hill. For over 200 years, Danjong lay in an unmarked grave, a forgotten king. Danjong wasn't buried alive in a tomb, but he was entombed nonetheless, entombed in exile, entombed by his uncle's paranoia, and finally entombed in a lonely and marked grave. His story is a brutal confirmation that in the theater of the Joseon court, being family was no protection. In fact, it could be a death sentence. This horrifying pattern of familial betrayal would repeat itself, and in our next case, we see another young prince, even younger than Danjong, fall victim to the same ruthless calculus of power. His life extinguished in a horrifyingly cruel manner. While the story of Danjong is a grand, sweeping tragedy of usurpation, the fate of Grand Prince Yongchang is a more intimate, and arguably more pathetic, tale of political expediency. His is the story of a child sacrificed not for the throne itself, but for the security of a new, unstable regime. It's a case that brings us chillingly closer to the claustrophobic horror of the original legend, a young boy, killed while trapped in a confined space. Grand Prince Yongchang was born in 1606, the son of King Seonyo. His birth was both a blessing and a curse. He was the king's only legitimate son born to the official queen, Inmok. This was a problem because King Seonyo already had another son, Prince Gwanghai, who was much older and had been the designated crown prince for years. Gwanghai, however, was the son of a concubine, which made his claim to the throne technically weaker than that of the newborn Yongchang. This single fact threw the court's succession politics into absolute chaos. King Seonyo was an old man when Yongchang was born, and he doted on the young boy. A powerful political faction saw an opportunity. They began to lobby the king to change the line of succession to set aside the adult, experienced Gwanghai in favor of the toddler, Yongchang. Their motive was pure political greed. If the child prince became king, they would rule the country as his regents. This placed Gwanghai in an impossibly precarious position. He had served his father and his country loyally, yet his future was now threatened by his baby brother. The court became sharply divided. One faction backed Crown Prince Gwanghai, arguing that to change the succession would invite chaos. The other pushed for Yongchang. Citing the legitimacy of his birth, the tension simmered until King Seonyo's death in 1608. In the end, the king never officially changed the succession, and Gwanghai ascended to the throne as the new king of Joseon. But King Gwanghai's position was anything but secure. The faction that had supported his baby brother remained a constant source of potential rebellion. And at the center of their plotting, whether he was aware of it or not, was the 2-year-old Grand Prince Yongchang. For Gwanghai's supporters, Yongchang was a ticking time bomb. As long as he lived, he would be a rallying point for their enemies. The storm finally broke in 1613. A group of men were arrested for plotting treason, and during their interrogations, they implicated Grand Prince Yongchang as the one they intended to put on the throne. It is highly unlikely that the 7-year-old prince had any actual knowledge of a conspiracy. But it didn't matter. His name was enough. Gwanghai's supporters seized the opportunity, declaring that Yongchang, despite his age, was a traitor who must be punished. A fierce debate erupted. Many officials were horrified at the idea of executing a child, but Gwanghai's faction was relentless. Initially, a compromise was reached. Yongchang was stripped of his royal title, reduced to a commoner, and exiled to Gangwon Island. The 7-year-old boy was torn from his mother and sent to live under guard. But for the hardliners in Gwanghai's government, this wasn't enough. The governor of Gangwon Island, the staunch supporter of the king, took it upon himself to resolve the Yongchang problem permanently. The official records of what happened next are chillingly sterile, but later accounts paint a horrifying picture. The governor began by isolating and weakening the young prince, severely restricting his food. Starving and alone, the child grew weaker by the day. Then came the final brutal act. The most widely accepted account states that the governor had Yongchang confined to his small room. He then ordered his men to continuously feed the fire for the underfloor heating system. The room became intensely, suffocatingly hot. The 8-year-old prince, already weakened by malnutrition, was essentially slow cooked to death. One source describes him clinging to the doorframe, trying to escape the unbearable heat, until he finally collapsed. On March 19, 1614, Grand Prince Yeongchang died. He was just 8 years old. The news was reported to the capital as a death from illness. King Guanghai, while perhaps not directly ordering the murder, did nothing to punish the governor. The threat was neutralized. But the cruel murder of a child prince sent shockwaves through the aristocracy and became a black mark on Guanghai's reign. It was seen as an act of profound immorality, and it would ultimately come back to haunt him. Years later, in 1623, a coalition of opposing factions would use the murder of Yeongchang as the primary justification for a coup that deposed King Guanghai. The fate of Grand Prince Yeongchang is a sickening demonstration of the Joseon court's capacity for cruelty. He wasn't buried alive, but he was killed in a way that mirrors the horror of that legend, trapped, helpless, and slowly killed in a confined space. His story confirms that no one, not even a child, was safe. But even this tragedy pales in comparison to the most infamous case of familial cruelty in all of Joseon history. A case where the legend of being entombed alive becomes horrifyingly, undeniably real. A case where a father, the king himself, orders his own son to be sealed in a box and left to die. Of all the tragic tales from the Joseon Dynasty, none is more shocking, more famous, or more directly aligned with the horror of being buried alive than the story of Crown Prince Sado. This is not a legend. This is not a myth cobbled together from whispers and rumors. This is a well-documented historical fact, recorded in excruciating detail by those who witnessed it, including Sado's own wife, Lady Haegyong, in her memoirs. It is the story of a king who became his son's executioner, and of a punishment so uniquely cruel it has fascinated and appalled people for centuries. Crown Prince Sado was born in 1735, the son of King Yeongjo. His older brother had died young, making Sado the sole heir to the throne. From the very start, his father had impossibly high expectations for him. King Yeongjo was a stern, perfectionistic ruler, a man who had ascended to the throne amid rumors that he had been involved in the death of his own half-brother. Deeply insecure, he projected that insecurity onto his son, demanding that Sado be a perfect Confucian prodigy. Sado was intelligent and promising as a boy, but he could never live up to his father's relentless, crushing standards. King Yeongjo would frequently humiliate his son in front of the entire court, berating him for the smallest perceived mistake. The king's affection was a weapon, and his anger was terrifying. This constant psychological torment from a father he could never please began to take a severe toll. Sado grew to fear his father, and that fear curdled into resentment and profound instability. According to his wife's memoirs, Sado began showing signs of serious mental illness. He developed bizarre phobias and obsessions, including a crippling anxiety about clothing that could leave him unable to get dressed for an entire day. His erratic behavior only earned him more scorn from his father, who saw it not as sickness, but as moral failure. As the years went on, Sado's mental state deteriorated catastrophically. The pressure pushed him into a spiral of violence. He began to beat his eunuchs and court ladies, and his rages became more frequent and more deadly. Eventually, he began to kill palace staff, his violence spilling outside the palace walls. The palace became a place of terror. The breaking point came in the summer of 1762. Accounts differ on the exact trigger, but the most damning accusation came from Sado's own mother. Fearing that her son's madness had become a threat to the dynasty and to the safety of her young grandson Sado's son, she went to King Yeongjo and begged him to deal with Sado decisively. For King Yeongjo, this was the final justification he needed, but he couldn't formally execute his own son. By law, a royal's body could not be defiled, and a formal execution for treason would also condemn Sado's innocent wife and child to death or exile. So, He devised a solution that was technically not an execution, a legal loophole that was infinitely more cruel. On a sweltering July day, King Yongjo confronted his son in the palace courtyard. He stripped Sado of his title and declared him a commoner. Then, he ordered a large wooden rice chest, about 4 feet square, to be brought forward. He commanded his 27-year-old son to climb inside. According to Lady Haigyong's memoir, Sado begged for his life, but the king would not relent. Terrified, Sado climbed into the chest. The lid was closed and sealed. He was entombed in a wooden box, left to die of suffocation and dehydration in the brutal summer heat. For 8 days, his cries could be heard from within the chest. On the 8th day, the chest fell silent. It was opened, and Crown Prince Sado was pronounced dead. King Yongjo, having disposed of his son, then paradoxically restored his title of Crown Prince and gave him the posthumous name Sado, which means to think of with great sorrow. It was a final, twisted act in a relationship defined by psychological torture. He then forbade anyone at court from ever speaking of the incident again. The story of Crown Prince Sado is the horrifying culmination of all the fears and brutalities of the Joseon court. It is the literal realization of the legend of a prince being buried alive by his own family. It proves that the bonds of blood were no match for the paranoid logic of absolute power. A father, a king, was so consumed by his own standards and fears that he subjected his son to one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable. This wasn't a rumor or a legend. It was a carefully orchestrated royal murder carried out in plain sight. We began this journey with a legend, the ghost story of a Joseon prince, buried alive by his own family. We found that the specific tale of Prince Jeongchon appears to be fiction. But as we've uncovered, the reality was far more terrifying because it was true. The legend is not a single story, but a composite ghost, a phantom assembled from the very real agonies of princes like Danjong, Yongchon, and Sado. The tragic fate of King Danjong shows us a dynasty so insecure that a boy king could be deposed, exiled, and murdered by his own uncle, his memory all but erased for centuries. The horrifying death of the child Prince Yongchon reveals a political machine so ruthless that an 8-year-old boy could be suffocated in a heated room simply for being a potential pawn in a power game. And finally, the infamous story of Crown Prince Sado provides the shocking proof that a father could, in fact, entomb his own son, locking him in a wooden chest to die in one of history's most ghastly acts of filicide. So, why did this happen? How could a dynasty built on the Confucian ideals of family loyalty and filial piety produce such monstrous acts of cruelty? The answer lies in the toxic brew at the heart of the Joseon court. It was a system that demanded absolute power for the king, yet surrounded him with powerful, feuding factions that constantly sought to control that power for their own gain. This created an environment of perpetual suspicion and paranoia. Every prince was a potential threat, every alliance was temporary, and every perceived weakness could be fatal. Power wasn't just a privilege, it was a matter of survival, and in the quest to secure it, the most sacred bonds of family were often the first casualties. The legend of the prince buried alive endures because it speaks to a fundamental truth about the Joseon Dynasty. The opulent palace, with its intricate architecture and refined culture, was also a tomb. It was a place where human emotions like love, jealousy, fear, and ambition played out on a magnificent stage, but with the highest possible stakes. The stories of these princes are not just historical footnotes, they are epic tragedies that resonate with the darkness that can exist within any structure of absolute power, and within any family. They are a stark and timeless reminder that behind the gilded facade of royalty often lies a history written in blood. The history of the Joseon Dynasty is a deep well of triumph and tragedy. If you found this dive into its darkest chapter compelling, please support our channel, Chronicles of Old Tales by subscribing and hitting that notification bell. We have so many more stories to uncover, and we want to hear from you. Which other historical mysteries or royal tragedies would you like to see us explore next? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on Chronicles of Old Tales.